dedinho no meio. Okay, sorry. You can, just skip like this.
Like this, okay, it's fine.
So let me... Tá funcionando? Estamos no YouTube? So, it's is it working? Okay. So, good afternoon to all of you who are here, and good afternoon to all of you that are at home listening to us. This is another seminar, and today we are really, really glad to have here the Professor Madalitso Phiri from the University of Joanesburgo. Madalitso Phiri is a critical Pan-African sociologist. I'm really glad to receive you here. We are really glad to receive you here again, since you have your fieldwork here many years ago. Madalitso is a postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Joanesburgo, at the Joanesburgo Institute for Advanced Study. He's currently converting his doctoral dissertation into a book, and we are looking forward to see your book. And today, he's going to give us a seminar based partially on his PhD, partially on his postdoc research. And the title is The Color of Inequality in South Africa and Brazil, Making Sense of Social Policy as Reparations. And I'm Renata Bichir. I'm research here at Center for Metropolitan Studies and also a professor at the Political Science. Thank you very much, Madalitso. The floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Can I...
Do you prefer?
No, I think sitting down is fine. Okay. Sure, thank you so much for having me here. It's always a pleasure to be back in Brazil. When I was last here, I was only 32. And I'm a 39-year-old grown man, and I got 2 kids, and the PhD is done. And I'm trying to really continue to work on these issues around inequality. So, as Renata said, I work on 3 things, on race and social policy and inequality between South Africa and Brazil. And I also pursue another field on black political thought and the sociology and history of race. And all of these things will actually come up in my talk. And I look forward to engaging and to discussing the things. So this is an ongoing work, part of my, as you've already said, my doctorate and my postdoctoral project. That's me. When I was in Recife, in the Northeast, my parents once lived there, so I visited them there. And I also did some field work there when I was here the last time, specifically Olinda, which is also things that I'll discuss later on in the presentation. And I just wanted to give a background of my study, of my presentation today. I'll talk about 7 things. One is to locate South Africa and Brazil in the complex histories of race and global formations, and then the research questions that inform my research, and then the methodology that is a building from my PhD study and then to my postdoc, and then I'll also provide something that talks about thinking about social policy reparations, and then the comparative dimensions between South Africa and Brazil, and new questions and the implications for political theory. And then I'll conclude. I hope you are with me, and welcome Clara also. Yes, she once hosted me here and helped me a lot in the PhD journey. So I'm excited to see everyone again. So my background, let me start with that. One of the things that I really write on is the idea of violence. How violence has actually been meted out through whiteness as a distributive regime. of material and advantages, like cumulative material advantages and disadvantages. So South Africa and Brazil, my argument is that we cannot understand the complex realities of contemporary public policy, decentralized or visions of having a much more equal society outside of these, historical, sociological paths. So South Africa always existed, from the colonial times in the 1500s, as a settler colonial state. And it's interesting that the Portuguese actually circumvented South Africa way before they came to Brazil, right? So it would have been interesting had that actually been a successful settler colonial project, that this conversation would be taking place in Portuguese. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. And a lot of critical scholars have written on this in the South African context, actually emphasizing the role of race in the political formation, in the social formation of South Africa as a society. And one of the things that actually happens is that settler colonialism itself was genocidal in its intent. And here too, I kind of depart from what Patrick Wolf has actually spoken about, that sometimes settler colonialism doesn't have genocidal intents, but at its very core, in the South African context, was that settler colonialism was about the elimination of the native and setting up new institutions that would become part and parcel of a global racialized polity. And capitalism becomes a system of accumulation through dispossession. And at the center of that is an anti-black racist project of racialization. And all of these ideas that are carried out even in the 20th century. And Brazil, I've also argued, that is a classic case of a settler colonial state. That the coming of the Portuguese and even the different colonial powers that actually tried to occupy this place were part and parcel of a global imperial project of whiteness as a distributed regime. I trace it back to the agreement of the Papal Bull in 1493 that Isabella and Ferdinand, that this right that people could actually conquer the rest of the world, and that the world was divided across these two hemispheres for the occupancy and permanent settler colonial stereotypes and state formation that emerges from the 1500s up until I would say the end of slavery in 1888. And it's interesting that slavery, when slavery ended in Brazil, there was a project of branqueamento initially, like to really negate the contributions and the transatlantic slave trade as central to the building of Brazil as a society. Much later, racial democracy became so central to the imagination of what Brazil was, as this society that was imagining a country, a new civilization in the tropics. Whereas in 1888, when slavery had been abolished, more than 40% of the population was black, right? And these are histories that have actually been negated or erased or not actually spoken about in the Brazilian context, so much that class becomes a distinctive feature of understanding or comprehending inequalities, to the neglect of race itself. These are the things that actually inform my study, right? And when we actually arrive at the beginning of when Lula actually comes up in the early 2000s, there's this tsunami of leftist governments across Latin America, Evo Morales, people like Chavez, and all of these things, particularly on the South African left, there was this massive enthusiasm that South Africa also needs a Lula moment, right? And that Brazil was actually this society that was implementing programs, social welfare programs like the Bolsa Familia, and there had been massive reductions in inequalities. Now, I want to locate these kind of discussions within their wider implications of the things that I've already discussed. And sorry, those scholarship that have been written to suggest that Brazil is a model, or I can think of Barrientos writing on this, saying that talking about the silent revolution in the global South, and the Manchester School, Sam Hickey, and a lot of folk that had continue to think through with these things. I think it's important that we really need to pay attention to the things that I've actually highlighted and locate the transformation of society within the historical sociological path. And I argue that some of these conceptualizations, whether it's a Lula moment in South Africa or the Brazil for Africa movement, is rooted in an epistemic and social crisis that needs to be questioned. And I have, I think we've also seen, some of the work that has actually been done on that. Even these two democracies in even India and South Africa and Brazil have gone like the route of right-wing populism, and informing the so-called transformations that had actually been done. And so, we just need to pay attention to that. Now, what are the research questions that have animated my work? The first question that I ask is, can social policy really resolve the trans-historical inequalities in these aspiring democracies, right? And given that I was theorizing with my interlocutors, as I actually mentioned, is that their answer says, well, it's actually no, it's not. Because they're actually rooting everything in the ideas that have actually formed these hierarchical citizenships that inform their daily realities and the material advantages and disadvantages that they encounter. And just following that question, the next one is, if my interlocutors are saying that that's not the case, then how have political, economic, and social institutions been designed to achieve the desired social outcomes in both South Africa and Brazil? And the second one is, how have the values and norms of equity and justice been operationalized through these new social policies? So this is what informs my work. Now, as I said, that it's I have done some field work here before, and these are South Africa and Brazil. They offer very interesting perspectives of comparisons. There's Brazil is a massive country, as we all know that, 9 million, over 9 million square kilometers. So South Africa can actually fit into Brazil like 5 times. So, and it's also incredibly transformed, as an economic powerhouse, right? Depending on which indices you're using, sometimes it's the 5th largest economy in the world, sometimes 7th largest, or top 10 economy in the world. South Africa is not. It's in the top 30 economies in the world, right? But this is not to say that the two countries cannot be compared. I think they can. What I'm paying attention to is the welfare programs themselves. So Bolsa Familia, for example, at the time that I started doing my research, was 0.5% of Brazil's GDP. And the expenditure of, all of expenditure in terms of social welfare in South Africa was 3.5% of a $500 million GDP. So it's pretty huge, I think. And I think the two programs can actually be compared. And initially, South Africa had, the figures have actually gone up now because of the COVID. Close to 17 million people that are totally dependent on social grants and social welfare without work. So like you can just conceptualize that. And in a population of 65 million people. Outside of the Bolsa Familia, Brazil would have faced probably between 33 to 50% of its population in poverty, right? Outside of the Bolsa Familia. So I think I'm just trying to give that kind of a comparative perspective, and at the very same time, the Gini coefficients are really almost comparable. South Africa's oscillates between very high to 0.72 to actually sometimes 0.65. And Brazil, because of these conditional cash transfers, there's been like a reduction in inequality. Now, how should we think about and so I did my research for in the Northeast, in Recife, and here in Sao Paulo, and in South Africa. It was in the city of Joanesburgo, as well as the rural areas in Limpopo, and it's continuing work because I've gone back to revisit all the places that I've done my research in. So we really welcome your feedback on how to improve. So I interviewed initially like 45 people in both countries. And it was a group of policymakers and also beneficiaries of these cash transfer programs. And yeah, you can see the figures. 23 in South Africa and 15 in Brazil, and 3 in policymakers and 4 across the country. Across Brazil. And what were the demographics of people that I spoke to? So in South Africa, as you can see, it was interesting that all the people that I interviewed in these areas were what has traditionally been defined as black, right? And I say that because it's so important to think about this, because one of the things that South Africa has is that throughout its history, there was a legislated imagination of race, that people belonged to a specific racial category. You were black, African, Indian, colored, and white, right? And that was legislated, as I've said before, through this racial capitalist regime that defines or pretty much governed how cities or conceptualization of citizenship would actually be occupied. In the Brazilian context, because of racial democracy, right, this fictitious idea that race is something that is not so central to the imagination of this polity, it was interesting that these are the kind of figures that I got, and of course, some of them, that there's this really conceptualization of race as only talking to phenotype, right? Not necessarily as its constitutive organizing principle, as I've said before, from the 15th century. So people say they are morena or branca or parda and negra, So so it's interesting that in a society where race is not actually spoken about, people decided to see themselves as such, right? So it's just something to think about. The other thing is, how should we think about social policy, right? And I'm building up. One of the things that has happened is that Africa is always seen as a non-thinking space. When we think about the continent, it's not a place that can produce its own ideas for the importance or for the relevance of imagining the societal trajectory. And this, of course, is informed by a historical construction of how whiteness as a global redistributive regime has pretty much defined the realities of how knowledge is constructed, that only certain places can produce knowledge, and the knowledge in the global south is peripherized. And in light of that, there was one of the tools that I actually speak about is to think of social policy as transformative, and not only emphasize the social protection paradigm that had actually spoken about the only to protect, but I outlined from some of the work that was done by a prominent African social scientist, Thandika Mkandawire. He's late now. I just recently wrote a paper on him, which was published on Friday. So I'd be happy to share that. Yeah, and one of the things is these things that I speak about, like to think about social policy as protection, as production, as distribution and redistribution, and social cohesion as being an integral component of this. And it's actually coming from a Pan-Africanist nationalist vision. I can get into that if you want to know more about that. But I also argue that over and above thinking about social policy as transformative, what we actually need to think is social policy itself as reparations and world making. So I draw that, especially when I look at the contributions that have been made by global thinkers, African thinkers that contributed extensively to different disciplines, particularly when I think about the work of W.B. Du Bois, who spoke about reimagining the global racial contract and inaugurating a post-imperial world throughout his work, that the conceptualization of social policy as reparations pays attention to the global makeup, how modernity has actually come to be constructed around violence and its distribution, but to rethink that social policy itself becomes a component of world making and reparations. So how do I conceptualize reparations? The transatlantic slave trade becomes so central to that imagination because that enabled the cumulative material exchange to be at the center of the polities that were being born or constructed in the so-called New World. But it just didn't happen in the New World. It was a global project of centering whiteness to be a regime of distribution. Now, when we imagine social policy as world making, we think about two books. One I have here, Reconsidering Reparations, and Adom Getachu's book on world making. Where she traces the ideas of radical black thinkers across the past century and their agitations for remaking the world, not reforming, but to remake the world order as it was constructed from this imperial formation to undo the violence that have actually centered the black body to be at the center of capitalism. And that capitalism, a project that continues in its manifestations as racialized neoliberal capitalism in the 21st century, right? And I think we need to pay attention to this idea of constructive reparations, right? That when we want to conceptualize social policy is to move the material conditions that are a result of the liabilities of modernity. You know, it's to undo that, and I think it pays attention to tangible differences, and addressing the core moral and economic wrongs that have actually been informed by colonialism and the transatlantic slavery, and the distribution of the cumulative material and moral advantages in this world. That when we think about whiteness as a global distributive regime, it distributes the advantages across citizenship, across social institutions, across political formations. I mean, here in Brazil, there's always this fascinating idea that you have to deny blackness, right? So we've created all these categories of seeing race, 128 categories, which keep on changing every day, and somebody will speak, no, you're not black. Say, café con leche, like that blackness itself has to be negated to exist, because in essence, it is a material disadvantage, or this idea that, that was formed in the conceptualization of racial democracy, that how do you call it? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I couldn't say it.
No, it's okay.
Yeah. And
second class citizen.
That's yeah. And but that is a function of the global distribution of whiteness as a regime, and that's what we're challenging when we think about social policy. And I hope I'm making sense. And these are just some of the books that can actually help us think through that. I think when we begin to think, I can think of reconsidering reparations. Already mentioned that. World Making After Empire, the legacy of violence, the anti-black city. An important work that has been done by a Brazilian anthropologist based in the U.S. A forthcoming book on the politics of survival, white logic, white methods, when we think about rethinking methodologies and the research practices that have inherited as a function of this a global racial empire, right? The anti-black, the list is just endless. I can think of the Killing Consensus, another book that pretty much has just studied Sao Paulo as a city, as an anti-black city, right? Anyways, so yeah, I just wanted to include that in my talk, that these are some of the perspectives that I'm actually coming from. But then, how should we think about South Africa and Brazil in comparative perspectives? One of the things that people kept on asking me in my work or at every stage is, what is it that South Africa can learn from Brazil? And it's not necessarily to say that Brazil has not done great things or amazing things in policy, transformation, but I do think that we need to pay attention to how capitalism or racialized capitalism has actually homogenized experiences, like global experiences, and going back to those perspectives that I've actually mentioned as the talk was actually starting. Like, what really are the foundational units of how these polities function, right? And for me, that is something that I'm really interested in. And I'm not negating, studies on policy transfer and all of that. I think it's important, but I think sometimes when we just create this, say Brazil for Africa programs, then it's also devoid of its relevance. That Africa is always positioned as this place that is constantly being patronized. That the continent has to learn, it can't give, it's informed by violent lexicons, which need to be problematized further in our work on public policy, right? So I think we need to pay attention, to the regional disparities, like particularly how, the capitalist regime or engine continues to distribute material disadvantages to folk that are poor and live on the peripheries, right? And that we should centralize or pivot race, class, the intersectionalities of geographical inequalities, and how all of these encompass the idea of what it means to be alive again, right? To exist in a polity that is not predicated on anti-black racism. And for me, I think when we do that, then we begin to think or theorize about having a very important contribution from the Global South for the purposes of further theorizations. And that's what I'm hoping to do as I theorize with my interlocutors, right? And I'll just take you through some of the things that were said, like in the South African context. This is one person, my interlocutor says, we never go to bed on an empty stomach because the grant money that I receive enables me to provide the family basic needs. It just does not meet all the things that I want to provide, but it maintains us as we never run out of food or sleep on an empty stomach. Now, when we think about like cash transfer programs, at least in the South African context, is this, constant peripheralization which I think it goes back to the poor laws when we think about public policy, right? Like that people have to plead or beg their poverty, or this constant conservative idea that people are poor because they're not able to work, or they're lazy, and I think this response pretty much touches on some of these reflections that actually the way we've actually designed cash transfer programs is that destitution becomes part and parcel of what it means to exist in these so-called democracies of the Global South. And we don't pay attention to the idea of, but what does it mean to have wholeness? What does it mean to exist, to be a functional, literate person, to have all your capabilities actually being met in this, in a way that we think about what social rights or democratic rights are all about. This is another response from Mariana, and these are pseudonyms. They're real people, but they're not, for purposes of ethics, you have to hide the names. So she says, inequality is a historical question. From the beginning, there were families that held all the economic power, and the same structure remains. It began in the colonial era. One family had control of sugar plantations, and there are some workers there who did not have a house. I am trying to fight for my own rights, for my own rights too, but it is tough. Programs like the Bolsa Familia try to decrease this inequality, but they're not able to. We need to have another solution. It is hard for me to even comment on this because I do not know how. Now, I think, when we think about this code, it takes us to this conceptualization of the world-making project that I'm talking about, of social policy as reparations, as constructive, because she's actually paying attention to the structural conditions that have defined her depravity. The Bolsa Familia is not enough, right? So it means she continues to live in perpetual poverty, in perpetual destitution, but at the very same time, she's more conscious about the materialities that have informed her position. She talks about families that have actually owned all the wealth here in Brazil, right? I'm not making it up. This is a response that actually came from my interlocutor. And, it pushes us to really reconsider, the positions that we hold about social policy. Another one says the amount of the Bolsa Familia is so low that it does not take people out of poverty. It takes people out of extreme poverty, but those that are beneficiaries of Bolsa Familia are still poor because of the amount of money that they receive is less than half the minimum wage. And you can see that this is, it was a while ago that I did this research. The amount of Bolsa Familia is 1/3 of that, around 200 reais, $48. Try to live with 200 reais, and we can talk about what you can pay with this amount of money. The amount of money Bolsa Familia pays is just to take people out of extreme poverty. It is very low. Okay, we can move on. So, what is actually in the South African context? And I'm oscillating between these two societies, as I've already highlighted, is that the number of poor folk actually increased, or the percentage of the working poor actually increased over the years since social assistance had, been implemented. Of course, you can look at the percentages. Brazil has a lower percentage of that. If you're looking at 2017, it's around 14%, whereas South Africa has close to 18%. But what we actually had is that there was an increase in precarity, right? So we have, at a time where, over close to a 20-year period where these redistributive regimes become much more intense, but at the very same time, as the number of the working poor, some people contest that category, as that increases, what you have is also an increase in precarity. And the other thing is that in my theorizing with my interlocutors, those also responses to hunger as a problem, right? So I can think of, Marilia right here in Osasco, who said that 15 days ago there was no food at home. And this is not post-COVID, this is pre-COVID, right? As I have said, everyone is currently unemployed, and I have a psychiatric condition. The church sometimes helps, but it is still difficult. The food that we buy is very basic, just beans and rice. We do not always have everything we need. In my house, we are 7 people. Everything would change without the Bolsa Familia, especially paying for electricity. I would be without electricity and water, and the children would be without food when they are working. But when they are working, I only pay for electricity and water. But when they are not working, I also pay for food. I've been receiving the Bolsa Familia for 10 years. I think we can read into the depravity into that. And I think for me, this is a function of how capitalism or these neoliberal conceptualization reconfigure the state-citizen relations that poor folk continue to plead destitution.
Yes, you should. You have 5 more minutes.
Okay. Let me just go through. I wanted to take us through the South Africa's Gini coefficient. You recall that I said it has like one of the highest Gini coefficients in the world. It's interesting that when we disaggregate that data across groups that have actually been racially categorized, constructed as through the regimes of whiteness, that black African continue to be on the lowest share of the both income and wealth. So South Africa is interesting in a sense that white folk contribute, are a minority, 5 million out of 65 million people, and white folk control close to between 60 to 65% of all wealth in South Africa. Like you can think about that. It's not any different in Brazil, although we don't actually want to discuss that uncomfortable reality of race. It's pretty much almost similar. But if we collapse the categories of colored and black African, I think the Gini coefficients actually just continue to be staggeringly high. So what has actually happened is that there's been both inter and intra inequalities, right? Inter-class and racial inequalities in the context of South Africa, even as these redistributive regimes continue to be championed. In the case of Brazil, I'm not going to go through that. I wanted to show this graph here that in one sense, as Bolsa Familia became much more popularized, that we saw a decrease in both the Theo and the Gini indices. So it's the opposite of what's happening in South Africa. That on average, like if you look at the Theo index, is that the last figure that is recorded in 2015 was around 0.48. The highest being in 2004. And similarly, the Gini, right? That the last figure that was recorded was even much lower than the Theo index. But what is it that has happened is that we've had cases of concentration, right, of income. That the share of income and wealth actually has gone to the top income deciles, as you can actually see in these figures. Sorry, this is actually Sembrap data that you once pointed me to. And we can discuss that further because I know that I'm running out of time. Now, these are some of the pictures that I've actually taken. If you look on the left, that's not actually the south of France. It's in South Africa, right? You can think about that. Maybe Patrick has been to some of these places. I don't know. These are some pictures that I took like recently. One on the right over there. It's a place where I have been doing my field work. This is a view from a place where I'm currently staying here in Bayes. And at the very same time, I think this picture just speaks. Parazopolis. Yeah, I'm going there on Monday, so it's gonna be interesting. And right here on my right, it's in the middle of Johannesburg. One of the richest and powerful cities on the African continent. And just what separates this picture and that picture, separated by 10 kilometers, literally, And I think for me, when I think about like the reparative dimensions of social policy, is that if this world continues to be what it is, then we need to unthink our tools, and we need to ask new questions. And I want us to live on that, because the normative assumptions of social policy have actually pretty much like present a lot of challenges, right? And I think a lot of it is informed by colonial fascism, that half of the world lives with the realities of colonial fascism, which I still call neoliberalism, as part of that project of reconfiguration of state-citizenship relations, and the existence of poor folk to be in these positionalities of dystopia perpetually, right? That we can design social welfare programs, but they continue to plead poverty, And I think there's just something problematic about that. And if we don't pay attention to the discussions on, racial capitalism and how it has actually constituted our democracies, then we're asking the wrong questions. And I think I have 4 questions that maybe can help us, to move forward, to think about the future that we want. And the first one is, what must our economies look like to respond to our social problems, right? And secondly is, what are the root causes in the material and institutional sense of these current problems? And thirdly, how do we build like algorithms, institutions, rules, laws, social movements, or revolutions that do the ordering of these problematic realities that we live with? And for me, coming from a Pan-Africanist perspective, is what kinds of institutions will create like conducive conditions for the flourishing and political aesthetics for the existence of a global African polity. Considering that the project of colonial modernity was that of dispersion, and in creating new races, across the different hemispheres. I think I'll end there and just say that I think what we have actually seen in the context of both South Africa and Brazil is questions that we need to think social policy as reparative, and the social contract, and there's black political theorists and political philosophers that have written extensively on it, and that we need to pay attention to the patterns of commodification that have reconfigured the state-citizenship relations. And I can say more on this, but I'll end here. And thank you so much, and I really appreciate and I look forward to engaging if there's any questions.
Thank you. One microphone. Thank you very much, Madalitso. I think it was really, really nice. Now we have our discussion. Do you mind exchanging? Because I have to. Sorry for the mess. Let's put Clara here. Maria Clara is a former PhD student here at Political Science. She's a really good friend of both of us. And she's now a professor at the University of Coimbra in Portugal. Let me find Clara here. Clara, thank you very much for accepting to discuss with us the seminar of Madalitso. The floor is yours.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah? Am I coming through?
Yes.
Amanda?
Yes, it's fine.
Yes? Can you hear me? Yeah?
You can start, dear. It's fine.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay,
please,
okay, great. So thank you. I'd like to thank Renata for the invitation to discuss Madalitso's presentation. I'm very happy to be back to my former home and to engage in this discussion, even though I have to take part in it virtually. I look forward to coming to Brazil very soon. Hope that this will happen very, very soon. It's also very nice to see Madalitso again. We met for the last time in South Africa. I think it was back in 2016. So I am very happy to reconnect with you. And thank you for an extraordinary presentation. It is very, very interesting to be challenged by you and to be and to see how you address the debate on cash transfers and on social policy. I think it is very provocative, and I'll try to make a few comments in order to further this debate. So you asked how can social policies contribute to resolve racial inequalities? The first thing that came to my mind is that if we look at South Africa's experience, South Africa's experience, we can see that social policies are deeply connected to race inequality in the country, since South Africa's social protection development was closely connected to apartheid, and race was initially an important aspect to determine whether a person would have access to grants or not. And later, after the 40s, when it was expanded to everyone, it was still determinant in order to, because according to race, you would receive a certain level of a certain amount. And I think that if we are discussing and comparing South Africa and Brazil, this is an aspect that is very interesting. And in that sense, one could argue that the policies, the changes that were introduced, at least in South Africa, immediately after, immediately before, actually, and then once again in the 90s, with the introduction of the child support grant, would, in a certain sense, contribute to minimize racial inequalities. However, we do see that even though cash transfers of various kinds that's spread across the world, and that were perceived somehow as a sort of a magic bullet, even though there were numerous voices that have criticized this idea and shown the limits of these programs. Even though we have seen impressive developments over the 90s and across the past 20 years, we can see that huge inequalities and poverty still prevail. And this thus forces us to ask new questions and to try to understand what types of new instruments we can design in order to better address these problems. And as you pointed out, there are other forms of conceiving social policies and social protection in particular that are being discussed. And I think that Candelari's proposal, and that was adopted by the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development of Transformative Social Protection, This is an approach that leans towards universalism, which would imply reconsidering not only social policy itself, but also the way the economy is organized. Is an idea that was advanced and tackle down this problem that we found of having different dimensions that affect inequality, and that should be integrated when we are thinking about social protection and social policies. But it was also an idea that found great resistance, especially if we think that international financial institutions are the ones that, such as the World Bank or the IMF, are the ones that are central in defining social protection. This is an idea that that does not enter their agenda, and that collides with what they are trying to put forward. Another idea that was presented that was advocated both in Brazil and South Africa was the adoption of a basic income, and this was an idea that also found a lot of resistance, especially in South Africa. And then we also have a discussion of going back, at least in South Africa, but also in other countries in the region, of going back to indigenous social protection in parallel with the systems that we have already going on, and trying to integrate social policies as they are designed right now with other community-based interventions that have been going on for the past decades or even centuries, as a way to better respond to the problem of poverty and inequality, and of surpassing these dimensions that have been disregarded by social policies the way they are designed right now. So maybe if you could comment a bit on those strategies, and maybe if you found anything regarding that in your research, and how this has been treated by some of the scholars that have been and how this is being discussed in South Africa. This would be very interesting, I think. And also, I think that we also have to take into consideration what are the conditions so that other forms of social policy that have to be present, so that other forms of social policy can emerge and be tested in order to assess whether they would better respond or not to the problems that you have identified in your research. And I should end it here for now, so that you can have other questions, and so that we can listen to you. But I'll be happy to continue to exchange and ask other questions later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clara. Maria Clara Oliveira. Now, Madalitso, would you like to comment, and then we open for another questions? What do you prefer?
Any order. I think
you can get more.
Yeah.
Okay, so I have some comments, but first I will open to the audience, and we still have one question from the internet. We have a lot of technology, so I have to. Oh, now we have more. Okay, we have 2 questions so far, and you can 1 minute. Andrea, who is listening to us from the YouTube, asks you how to promote a solid humanist view among those who are not white and privileged, and not just be fighting against the oppressors and searching reparation. Okay, it's more a comment, but another question from Zoe Bican. Nice to see a UJ colleague here in São Paulo. you know Josué Buchanan? I don't know, but he's from, or she, sorry, no, from the University of Joanesburgo. If we are, and then the question, sorry, if we were to take a reparations-based view of social policy, would there still be a role for cash transfer programs? If not, what should replace them? And just go back to Clara's point. Now, Eduardo, and you have to use the mic, I think. Como que a gente solta isso? Não?
Você solta, nunca mais se gruda. I was wondering around the idea of the reparations that probably you got much deeper in the book, certainly did. But I was in this dialogues with this last question a little bit, because in both, I was thinking both in the analytical sense and in the normative sense. Social policies are kind of in the Marshallian format. They are racially blind in this sense. In CCTs are like that, unless you design specific instruments to target this, as Clara mentioned. But at the same time, so how do you think these social policies that have been developed during the pink tide, during the last wave of left-wing governments in Latin America and other places, and also in Africa after apartheid, how they have dealt specifically with the racial question, in normatively or in terms of the future, what kinds of policies, of social policies, could get deeper on the racial element? We have a strong discussion in Brazil about the incorporation of territory in social policy, which is kind of racially blinded again. All these things are correlated, because black people are mainly poor and black people are in segregated places in the city, so the territory helps, but they are kind of blind in the sense of not having this as one of the elements. What kinds of policies would you think?
Thank you. Anybody else? May I add more, or do you want to? Okay, I think it's better. I should mediate, not make a mess. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, all right. Thank you for the fascinating questions. I just wanted to go to Clara's conceptualizations, and I'll keep it quick. It's always fascinating. For me, I cannot abstract and it's all interrelated, right? The views of how the world has actually become to be constituted, particularly after 1945, and how humanity functions, right? So the adoption of unreached as an institution, or its creation even as a peripherized institution in the UN system is very problematic, if we think about that. When I think about alternative ideas and designs of what kinds of social policies should we imagine, I always go back to this. What was the world of empire, and what did it constitute, right? So the Bretton Woods institutions are all imperial institutions. That's just my position, and it's not to say that it's an end debate. We can talk about that and discuss. And what is it? And this is the project that I think Adom Getachew discusses, right? She reflects on it deeply, in world making after empire is that what the erstwhile colonized people agitated for a different world that was free of non-domination, right? So, I mean, we need to think about that. If social policy has been constructed to always negate, Sylvia Winter talks about this, right? Like that the experiences and encounters of slavery is that you always miss, you are always constructed as the bastardized other. That the things that are actually due to you are half missed chances. It's missed chances in education, chances in work, because you always have to plead your existence, So, I mean, here we think about, work and welfare, whether it's under the Vargas regime and even in previous times, even military regimes, is that certain people cannot be part and parcel of that. So it's missed chances. You always appear as an otherized person that's not full, So if that idea is not working, why do we continue to insist that it works? I mean, for me, that's the first thing that I always think about. I'm like, if we've constructed the world historically, that only certain groups of people should be at the center of power and existence and privilege and protection and citizenship, why is that an idea that we champion? I think we need to jettison that. I think for me, that's like my... of course, the question where we disagree is about the how. Like how should we go about it? But African folk have always tried that idea, right? So you had these in their problematic and progressive ways, like across the African continent, the wave of decolonization, which World Making After Empire discusses, is like to really imagine that this is how the world of policies that are not based on domination will look like, right? I think for me that's the first thing, But so we like to say, okay, no, but it's just an idea. But the construction of modernity is an idea. It started out as an idea in the 15th century, as I've highlighted, and we live in it. So why can't we imagine another idea, right? Like a world that is beyond this world that is predicated on race, is predicated on reducing certain hierarchical citizenships. I mean, it's always interesting when I visit these places and how my humanity is questioned through the passport. And how I have to plead to come to Brazil. I have to plead to go to America. Like this African who is coming here to rob, to do all these things. And that is constitutive of black life. Even in this city like Sao Paulo, in Rio, across. And, I'm in South Africa, So it's this global regime of distribution, it needs to be problematized. I think we cannot imagine, what that will look like. Now, maybe to Eduardo's comment is to say, okay, now, social policy is not is colorblind. Okay, fair enough. Now, I think the task, in the Marshallian sense, the task that Dayo actually does in reconsidering reparations is to historicize, these regimes of distribution, right? To say, okay, if there's a policy regime that is colorblind, then why is it the case that the violence in the racialized polities continues to be meted out to black folk? And what can we do about it. One of the things that he extensively reflects on is on Katrina, Hurricane Katrina, and the environmental crisis. And I think I've always been convinced, but I think I am much more convinced that the future of the world, especially with the question on solidarity, depends on us imagining what the environment looks like. Because one of the things that capitalism does is to displace, or at least neoliberal capitalism is to displace the human from the non-human world. And unfortunately, we are linked in this like regime of violence, all of us together as humanity. And if we don't reimagine this construction of problematic motifs of violence as constitutive, then we're all bound for this like disastrous future. So there is actually no future, you know, to really think in those like dystopian terms, right? That if we don't seriously address this constitutive violent idea of the dispossession, accumulation through dispossession, and at the very same time the raping of the environment, which that is actually is distributed to black folk, indigenous folk, as we saw with Bolsonaro, you know, with the Amazon and all of that, that future is actually linked even to those people who actually are positioned in places of privilege, right? And I think, for me, the problem with neoliberalism is that it disrupts love and hospitality. It disrupts solidarity. And it's always interesting, like, you know, I could have used so many examples in my research. You know, you find like all of these responses from, you know, from most of the mothers or the women that I interviewed, they're talking about like neighborliness. And, you know, it's my vizinho, you know, that I can actually exist. I'm tied to this person, although I am not really related to them in one way or another, you know. But it's the idea of racial purity and hierarchical categorization that disrupts that type of solidarity. And yet what the poor are telling us is that even in the midst of precarity, we can still make sense of our lives through solidarity, you know. And why is it so difficult for us to conceptualize that? You know, when people sit in Washington and London and all of these places that are thinking about like these individualized approaches, which I argue that it's just a militarization of social policy. So do we want to be living in a world that is constituted around war, violence, and dispossession? Or do we want to design a world that is constituted around love, solidarity, and hospitality? You know, I think for me, we need to, from a political philosophy point of view, I think we need to problematize these ideas. You know, and I do not think that to the other colleague that then cash transfers would have a role in that world, but we would have universal conditionalities that reverse the liabilities that have been inherited in the project of modernity. Yeah, and at the core of it, most poor folk or destitute folk live with dystopian views every day. I mean, dystopian realities, and there has to be a material transfer, like at the you know, to reimagine that post-imperial world.
Thank you very much, Madalitso. Are you familiar with the work of Conceição Evaristo?
No.
Escrevivência. Okay, we can discuss this later during the coffee, because how we connect the way we live and the way we produce knowledge and the way we write about this in the academic world. And she's a very important black scholar here in Brazil, and I think you should be familiar with her work. So, anybody has a question? Yeah? Could you please come here, because we need to talk in the mic?
Pode falar em português ou não?
Pode. right? I can help you. He understands everything. Okay. He speaks slowly. Fala devagar.
Parabéns, professor e professora, pelo debate, pela apresentação. Acho que, sim, eu concordo que nós estamos num universo pobre intelectualmente e pobre criativamente, porque os programas de transferência de renda são filhos do PIGU, são de 1919. Todos eles.
Explica o que é PIGU para ele, o que ele não
PIGU é o professor do Keynes. Então nós não chegamos no Keynes ainda. O professor do Keynes, que fez as continhas primeiro, segundo a professora Marta Rett, lá em 1919, 1920, de que tinha que dar algum dinheiro para os pobres. Que o jeito era dar algum dinheiro para os pobres. Então, acho que no centro do debate, das questões que o senhor coloca, está a miséria do pensamento acadêmico, ou o quanto a universidade ela se acomodou a uma lógica normativa dessa regra, dessa lei geral do PIGU, que foi a lei que foi dominante, pelo menos nesses últimos tempos. Aí o senhor traz na apresentação a palavra fascismo colonial. E o senhor fala muito de violência. Foi falado de amor e de solidariedade, de território. Eu diria que são horizontes epistemológicos para se construir um pensamento inovador em políticas públicas que tem dificuldade no debate. Eu gostaria que o senhor comentasse em que medida os últimos acontecimentos no Brasil, na história do Brasil, desde 2013, revelam, para usar o modelo dos ruídos do Einstein lá, que ficam por milhões de tempos no universo, ressonâncias desse fascismo colonial. E como você enxerga chamar isso de fascismo, isso que se vive no Brasil. Hoje o governador do estado de São Paulo disse que vai colocar seguranças armados nas escolas e que a polícia militar vai estar nas portas de todas as escolas. Não sei que ambiente intelectual que é isso. Né? E sintetizando só para como o senhor enxerga essas novas coalizões muito mais difíceis de governos na América Latina, como o do presidente Lula, porque o principal problema do PIGU é retirar, no meu modo de ver, a dimensão de cidadania política, né, desses cidadãos. Ele chamava de pobres, ou de lei dos, ele atualiza a lei dos pobres, o debate do século XIX na Inglaterra, e o que os países fazem, como o Brasil, por exemplo, não é uma redução grave e violenta da cidadania, que revela nessa pesquisa do senhor, quando o senhor coloca essa moça de Osasco, que ela fica meio tímida, meio envergonhada. Essa é a morte da política, e é a política que inventa o mundo. Né? Então, se transforma essas pessoas em beneficiários. Roubam-lhes a cidadania política. E tem muita gente que se acotovela para ficar do outro lado do balcão servindo os beneficiários. Né? Então, como o senhor enxerga isso também? Esse sequestro do poder político de transformação. São várias perguntas, mas muito obrigado. Era muita reflexão que o senhor traz. Parabéns pela exposição, pelo encontro.
E seu nome?
Meu nome é Sérgio.
May I add something? And then we close. Okay, we can continue. If I don't know.
If you allow. You are the boss.
Okay, I will add something and then you add. It's okay? So, Madalitso, your answer it's complex because we need a new epistemology okay? A new way of think about our categories. And in your PhD, you go deeper into this, you know? You depart from a critical perspective on the northern typologies of social welfare. This is very important. You are not departing from Spin-Anderson. Actually, you are recognizing this traditional way of thinking about modes of or regimes of social welfare, and you advocate for a new way of thinking about social welfare, right, from the global south. So the departing point is how we build this, and you could you please discuss more on this and how the Black political thought can help us, because we have this type of reasoning also here in Brazil. It's very hard to fit Brazil into those traditional welfare typologies. So we have this discussion in Brazil. There are many connections from Brazil to our case. And I think this is one issue, very important one. And for sure, there are a lot of limits when we think about, you are thinking about how we change the world. So for me, it's interesting to see how you pick Bolsa Familia or CCT programs, because they are, a small grain of sand, in a huge. For sure, there is no way of fixing or how transformative they can be, and how we connect in a more analytic, more traditional or analytical perspective. How we connect these levels, how we connect the CCT programs and how they help people to get by but not get ahead sometimes. We are talking about basic needs, as you show it in your slides, But we do need to talk about survival, but we need to talk about more things, much more. How we desire and fight and, and dispute more. And there are other policies and other movements doing this. So shouldn't we look on this integration? In your PhD, you talked about this. You have a historical sociological perspective. You talked about institutions and how they are limited, but we all know they are. But you also talked about ideas. So how do we and this goes back to Clara's point. How do we dispute new paradigms, new ways of thinking the world, and how we dispute the idea of equity? How we go back to the discussion on universal social policies, but we cannot be blind to the categories. How poor people, how Black people, how women are not treated the same. This is a huge debate now in Brazil. How we look at the indicators of education and health and we are talking about universal social policies, And the indicators are not the same once we compare regions and territory in the country, or women and men, Black and white. So we are doing this. But how we connect? Actually, I think that now in social policy analysis, mainly in Brazil, but not only, we are looking at specific programs and policies because they are showcases. But they are not enough. We should go back to dispute in the way you are talking in your PhD. How we connect these different social policies and how they integrate it or not. You mentioned in your presentation the idea of intersectionality. This is a very interesting idea, but so far we are analyzing this in a more normative perspective. Since I study implementation, there are so few studies on this. How we make this happen? How we implement an intersectional policy, Because we know it's not easy. But I think we have different types of fights to be fought in different levels, what I mean? And I think you have more to say about this, how we can integrate. And there are other Brazilian scholars that might be helpful. But then we go on. Eduardo.
Very briefly, in continuing my previous observation, I was thinking about the recent policies in Brazil that are not colorblind or are not racially blind, or are more attentive to this to the issue of race and all the cumulativities, the negative cumulativities that were entrenched in the country. The first one is the land policy for quilombolas, for ex-slave territories. The second one is the many cultural movements associated to blackness that are present in the urban peripheries of the cities. And this connects with what Renata was just saying, of thinking of a different epistemology of policies. And this might lead to a certain design of policies that use the territory, the peripheral territories, the territórios periféricos, the territories of the peripheries, which are not necessarily black, but are full of blackness in this sense. And so maybe this makes more sense to me than the CCTs, in the discussion of the CCTs, and are bring a stronger focus on the argument of reparations than CCTs.
So now, Madalitso. You can say thank you. I can't say whatever you want.
Yeah, but I should say thank you indeed, because the debate is not exhaustive, and you know, I can say that there's many reflections that I can provide, not necessarily to design the policies. You know, I think that's a limitation of mine. But I think we really need to think about the world as ancestors, right? You know, not, you know, I'm a Christian, and not in of course in my context that would mean something else in the South African context, but I mean it in a sense that because of the cumulative advantages that have been part and parcel of modernity, then we can't just think that we are the only folks that have existed in this world, right? And so that provides us, in a sense of, so okay, what kind of a world can I be like a better ancestor, right? So that the person who's inheriting the next world will find it in a much better position. So that's one thing, and we need to really seriously think about that in a philosophical and in a material sense. You know, I think outside of that, but I still want to go back to Sergio's comment on colonial fascism and how it's actually also informed the city and the policies that we need to implement to make sure that the city is not an anti-black city, right? Which Alpes writes on it extensively, and Graham Willis in the Killing Consensus. I don't know if those books are translated into Portuguese, but they are Brazilian scholars. One is based at Santa Barbara, University of California, and the other one is at Cambridge. You know, I really highly recommend. You know, they did they're both anthropologists, so their work is extensive. You know, on São Paulo. But you know, so for me, I'm always fascinated with how. When I think about colonial fascism, right, it works in so many different difficult ways. it goes back to the beginning of my discussion, is that, that's the work that Charles Mills actually does by centralizing or problematizing the polity, which he actually calls, it is a racial polity, right? So he moves to say, okay, the world that we inherit is a racial polity. Now, there's this idea, I just don't know. I mean, I see like ridiculous things, on Twitter, like yesterday some senator, was incensed that Brazil and China will be able to trade using their reais and RMB because, oh no, we won't be able to use sanctions. I'm like, okay, it's like, okay, stay with that idea. The world is changing and it's changing rapidly, right? And so there's this myth of classical liberalism that because of the the world after 1945, that there were all these institutions that were created after Europeans had fought 2 world wars, and we could rewrite and rethink the world, and that other people didn't think about what empire meant to them, right? So it's these projects of world making that are deeply associated in the project of reconceptualizing the political, and so the liberal international order is a myth, and I say that with all my life. It's a myth because on the other side of the world, in the periphery, we live with the violence of that colonial fascism, that is meted out by the U.S. as an imperial and aggressor state, through the mission salvatrice and all of these practices that have been part and parcel of colonialism, and it is a problem, but at the very same time, it's also not a problem, because those who have agitated for a world that is non-hierarchical have been there. So they showed us. So the anti-colonial movements of the 20th century, starting with Du Bois, even going way back to the Quilombos and the resistance, that Eduardo speaks about, that the Malay Revolt in 1835 shows us that it's actually possible to exist on the periphery and imagine a different polity. Haiti, a critical revolution that is sandwiched between the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but it's not spoken about and written about. Black radicals have been writing on it extensively. I can think of C.R. James, the Black Jacobins, extensively rethinking, or thinking with the role of Haiti in reimagining the world. And not that it was a complete revolution, it's that people are building to make the world better. So I think for me, colonial fascism functions as a regime of remembering and making other people not to be remembered. Like in this case, Haiti. Oh, it's not a revolution. Let's just focus on the American and the French Revolution, liberty, equality, fraternity. But we know, if that is actually true, that liberty, fraternity, and equality are true, why is it that people in the global south don't have those things distributed to them as formalized, places of existence and where, life and human flourishing can take place, right? So we have a wrong political theory. I think that for me, I've just come to those realizations that it's inadequate. And colonial fascism forces us to think that there are no options, because those options are threatening to places of power and privilege, and they continue to reproduce these patterns of people that are like Bolsonaro and all of these characters, that I don't want to get into. Yeah. So, and it's a global phenomenon. This is not just happening here in Brazil. India, same thing. South Africa, increasingly, and but I think we need to really go back to like old models. And societies across the African continent that gained independence, at least in the first 15 years, experimented with some of these progressive approaches. So I can think of Ghana's Nkrumah, who was overthrown in a CIA coup, sponsored coup in 1966. I can think of Nyerere's projects, to undo these divisions. I can think of even conservative approaches in the country that I was born, but that was much more thinking about remaking. I was born in Malawi. It's a small country in southern Africa. I can think of Michel's projects in Mozambique. That the intersectionalities that you speak about, that he becomes so central to the imagination. Even connections to Brazil, right? That most of the people on the left in Brazil would actually see Mozambique as a place that pretty much provided that paradigmatic tool as a socialist utopia, and it's usurped, by all of these violences that we saw throughout the 20th century. So these projects have been tried before. They were not full of problems, but to just simply dismiss them as things that didn't work is also a problem. That we live with contradictions, and we need to make sense of that, right? The land question is always fascinating, right? Because I think colonialism again creates this idea of terra nullius, right? That sovereignty is actually denied to indigenous people, to African folk, or people that colonial modernity comes into contact with. And I think, or in the case of the U.S., sometimes, Patrick Wolf writes on this, that those treaties that are signed by natives and colonialists or settler colonies are somewhat fictitious, right? Because you have this idea of permanencies, that you have to dispossess the other. And in doing so, the concept of territoriality becomes central to how land is shared, that it is for a certain group of people, but I think then social and political theory needs to problematize sovereignty, and we go back to not the sovereign, but sovereignty, right? Because the right to sovereignty was denied to the colonized. Hence, one could actually just say that the idea of ownership becomes part and parcel. Cedric Robinson writes about this in Black Marxism, right? That some of these territories never had a conceptualization of ownership of land, right? At least in the place that I come from the continent of Africa, and a lot of African Marxists have written on this, like Achi Mafeje, he wrote extensively on it to say, okay, land was not actually a commodity. It only becomes a commodity upon the contact with the settler colonialism and all of the, Samir Amin, extensively expounds on this. I think in the case of Brazil, is to see that resistance that goes back to the Malay revolt, the Quilombos, the Mocambos, existing on the periphery, and resisting sovereignty. That we don't want to be defined by land as a commodity, which for me, I think it is the central premise of capitalism itself as a system, that land, which continues. We see it in social policy, that health becomes commodified, that, all of these things, but it actually stems from that historical idea that you have to dispossess the other and deprive them of all of these rights, and they cannot become part and parcel of this political project that is being formed. But it will take a lot. It will take a lot of time, and to contest that. But people are contesting, whether it's through the landless people's movement, even in South Africa. But I stop here.
So now we close.
Oh, okay.
Anybody else want to add anything? So thank you very much, Madalitso. It was really, really inspiring. Thank you very much. Clara, sorry, would you like to add something or to say goodbye at least? Sorry.
It was very interesting. Thank you for inviting me and for a wonderful discussion. It was really nice to participate in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Clarinha. It was really nice. So, thank you, and we close. Obrigada ao áudio.